The night nurse Emily Carter disappeared from Hollow Creek Psychiatric Hospital began like any other, marked by a biting October chill that crept through the parking lot and wrapped itself around the tall iron gates surrounding the building. The hospital stood deep in the countryside, far from busy streets and loud cities, like an isolated relic from another era. Its brick walls were weathered, its windows narrow and dim, giving it a grim, watchful appearance. The locals called it the last place you'd want to be after sunset. But for the staff who worked there, Hollow Creek was simply a job, a routine that became familiar over time. And for Emily Carter, it was a place she believed she understood well, until the night that shattered everything. Emily arrived a few minutes early for her shift, as she always did. She was known for her punctuality, her calm nature, and her ability to soothe even the most troubled patients. At 29, she had already gained respect among the hospital staff for her reliability. Her friends joked that she treated everyone with the same gentle voice, even when they were screaming or refusing medication. But beneath her calm demeanor, Emily often felt uneasy in one particular part of the hospital, Ward C, known to everyone as the locked ward. Ward C housed the most unpredictable patients, those who required constant monitoring, heavy medication, and strict isolation. To enter the ward, a staff member had to swipe a badge, type a passcode, and sign a security log. The rules were enforced strictly. Only nurses assigned to the night shift entered the ward after midnight, and only one nurse at a time was permitted inside unless a patient emergency required otherwise. Despite the strict procedures, Ward C had a reputation among staff for strange happenings. Lights flickering without explanation, doors locking on their own, and sudden cold drafts that came out of nowhere were all common stories whispered during night breaks. Emily didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural mysteries, but she admitted the ward felt heavier than other parts of the hospital, as if the walls held memories no one wanted to remember. That night, Emily's assignment included administering medication to the 8 patients in Ward C. She collected the tray from the medication room and checked each labeled cup carefully. She always double-checked to avoid errors, especially in that ward. The tray rattled slightly in her hands as she walked down the main corridor, but she blamed it on the cold. When she approached the security station outside Ward C, the night guard, Officer Mark Dixon, greeted her with a tired nod. He had been working at Hollow Creek for over 10 years and believed nothing could surprise him anymore. But even he disliked guarding the locked ward. "Rough night?" Emily asked softly, noticing the deep circles under his eyes. "Power flickered earlier," Dixon muttered. "Generator kicked in late. Lights went out for a few seconds. Gave everyone a scare." Emily offered a polite smile, though her stomach tightened. A power glitch was the last thing anyone needed in Ward C. Still, she tried to brush off the discomfort building inside her. After signing in, she swiped her badge, entered the passcode, and waited for the heavy door to click open. The sound echoed down the hall like a hollow warning. As she stepped inside, Dixon glanced at the clock. It read exactly 2:17 a.m. He would later swear he remembered the time clearly because the moment felt strangely significant, though he couldn't explain why. Inside Ward C, the hallway stretched into a long, narrow tunnel lined with small patient rooms, each secured by reinforced doors with tiny observation windows. The ceiling lights buzzed faintly, their dim glow casting long shadows along the floor. Emily walked carefully, her shoes making soft sounds against the tile. At the far end, Room 12's window glowed brighter than the others, indicating the patient inside was awake. She would check on him after completing the medication round. She stopped at the first room, knocked gently, and began distributing the medications one patient at a time. Most of them were half asleep, barely speaking except for a few murmured words. Only one patient, an elderly man with trembling hands, looked at her with fear-filled eyes and whispered, "He doesn't like the lights." Emily, assuming this was one of his usual hallucinations, offered him a reassuring smile and continued her tasks. Halfway through her rounds, she noticed something unusual. Room 9's door, which was always supposed to be locked from the outside, seemed slightly ajar. She frowned and double-checked her memory. Had she opened it earlier? No, she hadn't reached room 9 yet. She pushed the door gently, calling the patient's name. When no answer came, she stepped inside and found the room empty. The bed was neatly made, and the faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air. But the patient chart on the wall confirmed that room 9 did not currently house any patient. It had been empty for months. A sudden chill brushed past her, raising goosebumps along her arms. She stepped back quickly, closing the door with more force than necessary. She tried to calm her breathing. This was an old building. Drafts were normal. The empty room was normal. Everything was normal. But something deep inside whispered that it wasn't. After another 10 minutes, she approached the last room. As she prepared the medication cup, she heard a faint sound from behind her, a soft scraping, like shoes dragging lightly across the floor. She turned quickly, expecting to see a patient out of bed, but the hallway stood empty. Only shadows moved as the dim lights flickered again. Emily took a steadying breath and reminded herself of Dixon's words about the earlier power fluctuation. It was just the lights acting up again. That was all. She turned back to the door and knocked. Inside, the patient answered with a hoarse voice. She finished her duties quickly and stepped out into the hallway once more. She started walking back toward the exit, relief growing with every step. But halfway down the hall, her foot hit something small and hard. She looked down and saw one of the medication cups had fallen off her tray. She could have sworn she secured everything earlier. As she bent down to pick it up, she heard a whisper. It was so soft, so close, that for a moment she thought someone was leaning over her shoulder. Emily. She froze. The voice was not familiar. It was low, tired, almost sad. She turned around, but no one was there. Her breath quickened. She backed away, gripping the tray tightly. The hallway seemed darker now, the shadows longer. The lights flickered again, this time staying dimmer than before. She hurried toward the exit door, her pulse pounding in her ears. She reached for the handle. It didn't move. The door was locked. That was impossible. The door never locked from the inside. There was no switch, no mechanism that allowed a nurse to be trapped inside the ward. She pushed harder, but the handle refused to budge. Panic rose through her chest as she called out for Dixon. Silence. She knocked louder, then shouted his name. Still nothing. The lights flickered once more, then steadied. But the hallway behind her seemed darker than ever, as if the shadows were deepening. She tried to stay calm and reminded herself that every emergency door had a manual release panel. She only needed to open it with her badge. She reached for her badge, but before she could swipe it, she heard another sound. A slow, heavy breath. Directly behind her. She spun around. The hallway was empty. Emily felt her heartbeat racing hysterically. The air around her felt colder, thicker, as if something unseen stood only inches away. She stepped backward until her back pressed against the locked door. She clutched her badge in her hand, but her fingers trembled too much to swipe it. Then, from the far end of the hall, a door creaked open. The empty room. Room 9. Its door was now wide open, swinging slowly as if pushed by an invisible hand. A whisper drifted through the corridor again, clearer this time. Don't leave yet. Emily pressed the badge against the reader with shaking hands. The machine beeped. The door clicked. She didn't wait. She grabbed the handle and pulled it open. Security footage captured everything up until this exact moment. It showed Emily stepping through the doorway, her face pale and terrified. It showed her turning back for a split second, staring into the ward behind her. And it showed the door closing slowly behind her. But what it didn't show, what shocked investigators later, was that she never stepped out of the ward. When the morning shift discovered she was missing, the footage revealed a chilling detail. At the very second Emily appeared to walk through the doorway, the camera glitched for 2 frames. In those 2 frames, her figure blurred strangely, as if dissolving into static. Then the hallway was empty. Emily Carter had entered the locked ward at 2:17 a.m. She was never seen again. Detective Aaron Blake arrived at Hollow Creek Psychiatric Hospital on a cold, gray morning that seemed to match the mood hanging over the building. From the moment he stepped out of his car, he sensed an unsettling tension in the air, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. Officers moved quietly through the halls, nurses whispered nervously near the reception desk, and the usual sounds of a busy medical facility felt strangely muted. Blake had investigated dozens of missing person cases in his 12-year career, but something about this one felt different even before he knew the details. He was used to messy crime scenes, frantic families, and obvious clues. But Hollow Creek felt empty in a way that went beyond the disappearance of one nurse. It felt like everyone inside was afraid of something they refused to say out loud. Dr. Meredith Shaw, the hospital's director, greeted him outside her office with a handshake that was too quick and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was a tall woman in her early 50s, her posture straight and her voice firm, but Blake could tell she was shaken. Her hands trembled slightly as she gestured for him to follow her to the conference room, where she had prepared all the relevant documents. As they walked, she spoke rapidly about Emily Carter's work history, her positive reputation, her lack of conflicts with colleagues, and her dedication to her job. The detective listened carefully, noting the tension in her voice. He had learned over the years that people who hid things often talk too much. Inside the conference room, Blake studied the reports, the time logs, and the still frames from the security cameras. Emily had entered Ward C at exactly 2:17 a.m. The door closed behind her. No one else entered. No one else left. Minutes later, the lights flickered, and for 2 frames, the footage glitched. When the image returned to normal, Emily was simply gone. Blake replayed the footage over and over, hoping for detail he might have missed, but the answer was always the same. Emily Carter walked into the ward and vanished as if swallowed by the darkness. After reviewing the evidence, Blake insisted on inspecting Ward C himself. Dr. Shaw hesitated, then finally agreed, though her reluctance only deepened his suspicion. When they reached the hallway outside the locked ward, Officer Mark Dixon stood rigidly beside the door. His eyes were bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept since the incident. Blake introduced himself, but Dixon barely responded, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. When Blake asked him what he saw or heard that night, Dixon only whispered, "The lights shouldn't have gone out. Not there. Not in that ward." Blake attempted to press him further, but Dr. Shaw quickly interrupted, insisting they proceed inside before disturbing the guard any more than necessary. The moment Blake stepped through the door into Ward C, an unexpected coldness seeped into his skin. He paused in the entrance, scanning the dim hallway. The silence inside the ward felt heavy, unnatural, as if every sound had been swallowed by invisible walls. The patient rooms lined both sides, each with a small viewing window and locked door. Emily's medication tray still lay on the floor where it had been found, cups scattered across the tiles like the remains of a rushed escape. He crouched down and studied the tray. Nothing suggested a struggle. No drag marks. No footprints. No blood. Just a tray dropped mid-step, abandoned in a hurry. Blake proceeded room by room, speaking to the patients. Some were too sedated to respond, their eyes glazed and unfocused. Others muttered incoherent sentences about shadows, whispers, or things crawling along the ceiling. He had dealt with psychiatric patients before, and he knew how easily hallucinations could twist their perception. Still, something felt off. These weren't random delusions. The patients seemed genuinely terrified, as if they had shared an experience none of them could fully explain. One young woman with long, tangled hair pressed her face against the window in her door as Blake approached. Her eyes were wide, frantic. She whispered urgently, "Did he take you too?" Blake asked who she meant, but she only repeated, "Elias knows the doors. He knows how to walk through walls." A chill ran down his spine. He asked Dr. Shaw about the name, but she immediately brushed it off, insisting the patients often shared imaginary figures, especially during stressful events. Blake could tell she was lying. Her tight smile and stiff shoulders said she knew exactly who Elias was but didn't want to talk about him. Determined to get answers, Blake demanded access to hospital archives. Dr. Shaw hesitated again, but under pressure, she finally escorted him to the basement storage area, a dimly lit room filled with dusty boxes and outdated equipment. The old patient files were stored in long rows of metal cabinets that groaned when opened. Blake patiently sorted through dozens of folders, searching for anything unusual. After nearly an hour, he uncovered a thin file tucked at the very back of a drawer, its edges brittle with age. The name on the tab read, Elias Grant. He pulled it out and opened it. The first page contained a faded photograph of a boy no older than 17. He had dark hair, pale skin, and eyes that seemed to carry a sadness far beyond his years. The file described Elias as found wandering the woods in 1998, disoriented, malnourished, and talking about hearing voices from the walls. He was admitted to Hollow Creek for evaluation, placed under close supervision, and eventually transferred to the most secure area, Ward C. The notes grew stranger as Blake read on. Elias had reportedly told staff he could sense passageways where the walls forgot to stay solid. Doctors assumed this was a metaphor related to his hallucinations, but the file mentioned an incident where staff found him standing in a locked room that no one had opened for weeks. The final page ended abruptly. There was no record of his discharge or death. Just a scribbled note saying, "Unresolved matter. Do not file publicly." Blake raised his eyebrows. "Why wasn't this in the active records?" he asked. Dr. Shaw stiffened and claimed it must have been archived by mistake. Her reaction said otherwise. Before he could question her further, a nurse rushed into the basement, breathless, saying one of the patients in Ward C had been screaming uncontrollably and demanded to speak to the detective. Blake hurried back to the ward. Inside room 3, an older man with shaking hands insisted Elias was real. "He's still here," the man whispered. "They never let him leave." So he learned other ways. When Blake pressed him for details, the man leaned closer and said, "He walks without footsteps. He moves through the cold. If you hear him breathing behind you, it's already too late." Blake tried to reassure him, but the man cooled into himself, trembling violently. After finishing his interviews, Blake lingered in Ward C, unwilling to leave without one last look. The air felt colder the farther he walked down the hallway. He approached the empty room, room 9, the one where staff had found strange writing the morning after Emily vanished. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the walls were blank, the bed empty, the room spotless. But Blake's instinct screamed that something was wrong. He stepped forward and noticed faint scratch marks near the metal bed frame. Kneeling down, he ran his fingers across the grooves. They formed letters. Words. He squinted in the dim light and read them slowly. "I never left." The words were carved deep into the metal, far too deep for fingernails. Blake stood abruptly, his pulse racing. A slight shift in the air made him turn. At the edge of the room, near the doorway, faint footprints had appeared in the dust, footprints that hadn't been there seconds ago. They were barefoot, small, almost childlike. They led out of the room and down the hallway. Blake followed them cautiously, feeling every hair on his arms rise. The prints moved toward the exit, then stopped abruptly, as if the person had vanished mid-step. He crouched down and studied the last print, fresh and clear in the dust. Whoever made it had been there minutes ago, maybe seconds ago. Just as he rose to his feet, the lights flickered again. A cold breeze swept past him, though the air vents were silent. Blake turned toward the empty room one last time. For a split second, he thought he saw a figure standing inside, a silhouette, thin and still, watching him from the darkness. But when he blinked, it was gone. That evening, as Blake sat in his car taking notes, a thought struck him with sudden clarity. Emily Carter had vanished in a sealed ward where no one else had entered or exited. The hospital claimed Elias Grant no longer existed, but if he had never been discharged, transferred, or declared dead, then where had he gone? The answer seemed impossibly simple and horrifying at the same time. Maybe he never left Ward C. Maybe he had been there all along. And maybe, just as the patients claimed, he knew how to move in ways ordinary people couldn't. When Blake glanced back at the hospital before driving away, he felt a shiver run through him. One of the windows on the upper floor was dark except for a faint shape pressed against it. A pale face. Watching. By the time he looked again, the window was empty. The night the power went out at Hollow Creek Psychiatric Hospital would later be described by staff as the most terrifying event the building had endured since its construction. It happened 3 days after Emily Carter disappeared, at a time when everyone in the hospital was already walking around with heavy hearts and nervous eyes. The halls were quieter, conversations softer, and every creak or flicker of light made people jump. Even the usually stoic Dr. Meredith Shaw seemed more distracted than usual, often pausing in the middle of his sentences as if listening for something only she could hear. Detective Aaron Blake had returned that evening to finish his interviews, hoping to make sense of the tangled threads connecting Emily's disappearance, the strange patient testimonies, and the mysterious name whispered throughout Ward C. He had a gut feeling that he was only scratching the surface of whatever was lurking beneath the hospital's polished floors. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the building, Blake walked through the entrance and immediately sensed the tension thickening in the air. A nurse passed him in the hallway, her eyes red and tired. When he asked if she was all right, she shook her head and whispered, Something is wrong in that ward. I hate things at night. Things that aren't supposed to be there. Before he could question her further, she hurried away, leaving the detective alone with a sinking feeling in his stomach. Blake made his way toward Ward C, where Officer Dixon still stood post despite looking even paler and more exhausted than before. The guard barely acknowledged Blake's greeting. He just stared at the locked door behind him, jaw clenched tightly as if he feared something might emerge at any moment. Blake studied him carefully. Dixon's hands trembled slightly as he signed the security log, and when Blake asked about his shift, Dixon replied in a hollow voice that he hadn't slept properly since Emily vanished. "I keep hearing her," he muttered. "Footsteps. Someone calling my name. But when I checked the hall, no one's there." Blake frowned. "You mean inside Ward C?" Dixon shook his head. "No. Outside it." Blake opened his mouth to ask another question, but before he could speak, every light in the corridor flickered violently. The overhead bulbs pulsed like dying stars, shooting sparks of brightness before dimming to a sickly orange glow. The detective and the guard exchanged tense glances. Then, in an instant, the entire building plunged into darkness. The sudden silence that followed was suffocating. There was no hum of electricity, no distant beeping of monitors, no soft buzz from overhead lights. Only darkness and the pounding of hearts. Blake reached instinctively for his flashlight, clicking it on just as panicked voices echoed through the hallways. Nurses called out to patients. Patients screamed from their rooms. Somewhere deeper in the hospital, glass shattered. Blake shouted Dixon's name, but the guard was already fumbling with his radio, trying to contact security control. The line was dead. Before they could react further, a shrill alarm suddenly blared from behind the metal door of Ward C. It was the emergency lock detection alarm, triggered only when a door was opened without authorization. Blake's stomach twisted. The power was out. The security system was down. No one should have been able to open any door. Dixon grabbed his flashlight with a shaking hand and shone it on the ward entrance. The door stood slightly ajar. Blake pushed it open and stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the pitch black. The hallway was chaos. Patients screamed and pounded on their doors, begging to be let out or shouting warnings about shadows moving in the darkness. Some yelled Emily's name. Others cried about a man they claimed was walking between their rooms. The beam of Blake's flashlight trembled as he moved deeper into the ward. Something cold brushed his face like a frigid draft, though the vents had shut down with the power. He tightened his grip on the light. Dixon followed close behind, though Blake could hear the guard muttering prayers under his breath. As they walked, the temperature continued to drop until Blake could see faint puffs of his own breath floating in front of him. One patient, a middle-aged woman who had barely spoken during earlier interviews, was now screaming hysterically through the viewing window of her locked door. His back. His back. I saw her with him. She was standing right there. Blake rushed to her door. "Who did you see?" he shouted. The woman slammed her palms against the glass. "Emily. She was here with him." He had his hand on her shoulder. He told her it wasn't time yet. Dixon stepped back, heart thudding loudly. Blake glanced down at the floor and noticed something that made his blood run cold. The faint outline of footprints, small and bare, had appeared on the dusty tiles. They led from the center of the hall into the darkness, toward the last room at the end of the corridor, the empty one. Blake followed them slowly, every step cautious. As he neared the door, the screams of patients seemed to fade behind him, replaced by a low, humming vibration he felt more than heard. Dixon whispered, "We shouldn't go in there." Blake ignored him and pushed the door open. His flashlight illuminated the empty room. The metal bed sat where it always did. The walls were bare, but something new lay on the cold floor. A small card, white, plastic, slightly reflective. Blake bent down and picked it up. His breath caught. It was Emily Carter's ID badge. The silence pressed against him like a weight. He turned the badge over in his hand and immediately froze. Deep scratches had been etched into the plastic, 3 words written with something sharp. He took her. Dixon stumbled backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Who is he?" Before Blake could answer, the emergency light sputtered on above them, bathing the room in harsh, red-tinted illumination. The moment the lights flickered to life, all the patient doors slammed shut at once, some so violently the walls shook. Dixon yelped in shock. The screams stopped abruptly, leaving behind a haunting silence. Blake stepped out of the room, clutching the ID badge. Every instinct screamed that they needed to get out of the ward. As they reached the exit, Blake noticed something even more disturbing. The last 4 minutes of the blackout, according to the emergency system logs, had produced no motion detection readings in the ward at all, even though dozens of people had been moving and screaming. It was as if something had overridden the sensors, or as if something had moved that the sensors weren't able to detect. When Blake demanded to see the security footage to review what happened during the blackout, the head technician looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "We don't have any footage," he said. Every camera in the building shut off at the exact same second, and when the power came back, the entire memory system was wiped. Blake stared at him, stunned. Wiped? By who? The technician whispered, "We don't know." But it wasn't done manually. Blake left the room with more questions than answers. Someone or something inside Hollow Creek could move through the dark unseen, could interlock rooms, could erase evidence, and could appear or disappear without a trace. As he stood in the corridor, holding Emily's ID badge, he realized the patient's words were no longer delusions to be dismissed. They were warnings, and the name they whispered, the name the hospital tried to bury, returned to him with chilling clarity. Elias. Whatever or whoever Elias was, he wasn't finished, and Emily might not have been his only victim. Detective Aaron Blake had spent days trying to make sense of the events at Hollow Creek Psychiatric Hospital, but every lead seemed to twist back on itself. Security footage, patient statements, and hospital logs painted a picture of chaos, yet none of it explained Emily Carter's disappearance. The recurring name, Elias Grant, and the strange behaviors of the patients gnawed at him like a persistent itch he could not scratch. He had returned to the hospital early that morning, determined to dig deeper, certain that something, some hidden truth, was being deliberately kept from him. He spent the first few hours retracing the movements inside Ward C during the blackout, talking to nurses and guards, but no one had seen anything unusual. Everyone insisted that no one could have entered or exited the ward during the outage. Blake had begun to suspect that the answers lay not in what the hospital showed him, but in what it concealed. He had been reviewing construction plans, maintenance documents, and archived hospital blueprints for hours when he stumbled upon a notation that made his blood run cold. According to the plans, beneath Ward C was a level that had long been sealed off. The records described it as a lower floor built in the early 1990s, intended for patient isolation and experimental therapy rooms. After a series of structural issues were reported, the floor had been abandoned, bricked up, and officially declared off-limits. There was no record of it being destroyed, renovated, or removed from the hospital. According to the notes, the area still existed beneath Ward C. Blake leaned back in his chair, studying the blueprints. There were at least 5 rooms, one of them labeled simply as special containment, and a series of connecting hallways that staff could not access. He immediately requested access to the sealed floor. Dr. Meredith Shaw's reaction was swift and alarming. Her face went pale, and she stammered, insisting that the lower level was unsafe, that it had been condemned, and that no one should enter under any circumstances. Blake pressed harder, demanding answers, reminding her of the missing nurse, the strange occurrences, and the implications of hiding this floor from investigators. After an extended argument, she reluctantly handed over a rusted, old key and muttered, "Be careful. You don't know what's down there." The stairwell that led to the lower floor was narrow, steep, and covered in decades of dust and grime. The air smelled stale, tinged with mildew, and every step Blake took echoed ominously through the empty space. Dixon, the night guard, accompanied him, gripping his flashlight like a weapon, though his nervous energy made him nearly trip on the worn steps. Blake noticed the walls of the stairwell bore deep scratches, some vertical, some diagonal, as if someone, or something, had clawed at the surface. He paused to examine them, but could not make sense of the markings. The lower floor opened into a long hallway dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Broken medical equipment, trolleys, and rusted wheelchairs lined the walls. The air grew colder as Blake and Dixon advanced, the temperature dropping sharply until their breaths were visible in the weak light. It felt as if the floor itself exhaled icy air, pushing against them. Blake shined his flashlight down the hallway, revealing 5 rooms, all with steel doors secured by heavy locks. 4 of the doors were empty and silent, though the rusted locks suggested they had not been opened in decades. The fifth room was different. The metal door had scratch marks similar to those in the stairwell, and faint signs suggested someone had attempted to open it recently. Blake's heart raced. This was the first tangible sign of recent activity on the hidden floor. He pushed the door open with a loud groan. Inside, the room was chilling. Chains were bolted to the walls, the metal cold and rusted. A single bed, stripped of sheets, sat in the center of the room. It looked as though it had been used in restraint therapy, though it had been decades since any patient had been officially assigned to this level. What caught Blake's attention, however, was a filing cabinet in the corner. It appeared untouched, yet it hummed with significance, as if it contained the answers he had been seeking. He opened it carefully and discovered handwritten patient logs dating from 1997 to 1999. The entries were meticulously documented, describing patients who had been subjected to experimental therapy in isolation, sleep deprivation, and sensory manipulation. The handwriting grew increasingly frantic with each page, detailing the psychological and physical deterioration of the patients. Every log repeatedly mentioned the same name, Elias Grant. Blake read through the entries, his stomach twisting. Elias had been a teenager at the time, discovered wandering the woods, disoriented and malnourished, talking about voices from the walls. The logs described how the staff attempted to correct his hallucinations through isolation, and how he began claiming he could move between spaces where doors and walls did not exist. The staff dismissed him as delusional, yet one entry sent shivers down Blake's spine. It was the final note before the file abruptly ended. Patient vanished from a sealed room. No exit found. Recommend covering incident to prevent investigation. Blake closed the file, feeling a mix of disbelief and horror. Elias Grant had disappeared decades ago from a locked, secure room, never to be officially accounted for. And now, all evidence suggested that he, or whatever he had become, was still present in some form. He turned to Dixon, whose face had gone pale, his breathing shallow. "Did you hear that?" Dixon whispered. Blake shook his head. No, and then he did. A soft shuffling sound, almost like footsteps, echoed down the hallway. They were deliberate but soundless, moving closer. Blake held up his flashlight, swinging the beam back and forth, but the hallway remained empty. He followed the sound, his instinct screaming at him that they were not alone. The temperature dropped even further, the metal walls seemingly absorbing the warmth from their bodies. Blake's flashlight flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, he thought he saw a thin, pale figure in the corner, watching him. He swung the light back on, and it was gone. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. The sound of shuffling moved closer to the room they had entered. Blake held his breath, expecting a patient to emerge. But instead, the metal door at the end of the hallway creaked open slowly, as if pushed by an invisible hand. Blake motioned for Dixon to stay back and advance carefully. Inside the next room, the air was thick, almost suffocating, and the beam of the flashlight revealed a small desk with yellowed papers and a faded photograph of a young boy, Elias Grant. The photo was pinned to the wall with a rusted tack. The boy's eyes, though decades old, seemed alive, staring directly at Blake. A low whisper echoed through the hallway, soft but unmistakable. "You shouldn't be hey." Blake froze, his pulse racing. Dixon wanted to run, but Blake held him back, pressing a finger to his lips. The whisper came again, closer now, from the room they had first entered. Blake turned, shining his flashlight back toward the bed with the chains. The scratches on the walls seemed deeper, more deliberate, and then he saw them, footprints, fresh in the dust, leading out of the room and toward the stairwell. The prints were small, childlike, barefoot, yet unmistakably recent. Blake followed them down the hall, his heart hammering. When he reached the stairwell, he realized something impossible. The prints simply vanished mid-step. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had left them had disappeared into the air. Blake's mind raced. The logical explanations failed him completely. He had trained for decades to interpret evidence, to understand crime scenes. Yet this defied everything he had learned. The temperature in the stairwell plummeted further. His flashlight flickered violently, then steadied. Blake's eyes scanned the walls and floor, and then he saw it, a faint outline on the concrete wall of the stairwell. It was the shape of a young boy, pressed into the surface like a shadow, pale and solid enough to make his stomach turn. Blake took a cautious step forward. The outline disappeared as he blinked. Dixon whispered frantically, urging Blake to leave, but the detective pressed on, knowing the answers lay just ahead. He returned to the first room with chains and the bed. There was a new detail now, something he had not noticed before. Scratches on the floor, deeper than any before, forming letters. He bent down to read them. The words chilled him to his core. She listens. She understands. Blake's pulse quickened. He knew the message referred to Emily Carter. And he knew one terrifying truth. Whoever, or whatever, was behind these messages was still active, still present in the hospital, and still watching. He stood up slowly, realizing the danger he was in, yet also recognizing that there was no choice but to continue. This hidden basement, once thought abandoned, held secrets that could explain Emily's disappearance, the whispers of the patients, and the name that haunted the ward, Elias Grant. Blake understood now that the hospital was far more than a place of healing. It was a labyrinth of shadows, memories, and perhaps something unnatural, something that had endured long after the official records claimed it was gone. The detective felt the weight of decades pressing down on him. He knew that leaving without uncovering the truth was impossible, yet pressing forward could mean putting himself in the same fate as Emily. The air grew colder still, and the whisper came one last time, clear and almost gentle. You opened the door again. Blake's heart leapt into his throat. He realized that whatever had been locked away decades ago had never truly left, and the locked ward was only the beginning. The hidden basement was alive with its own rules, its own time, and its own residents. And if he wanted to find Emily, he would have to confront them. Detective Aaron Blake stood in the hidden basement of Hollow Creek Psychiatric Hospital, staring at the cold, rusted metal bed and the chains bolted to the walls. Every instinct in his body screamed that he had reached the edge of something beyond comprehension. Yet the mystery of Emily Carter's disappearance demanded that he press forward. The air was frigid, each breath a visible cloud that hung in the dim light from his flashlight. He tightened his grip on the beam, scanning the room once more, noting every scratch, every scuff mark, every faint imprint in the dust. The filing cabinet still sat in the corner, its patient logs spread across the floor. The entries chronicled decades of experiments, of isolation, of patients broken mentally and physically, all culminating in the repeated mentions of one name, Elias Grant. Blake had reviewed these pages countless times over the last few days, yet he had never felt the same level of dread he felt in this moment. The basement was alive with a presence that defied explanation. A shiver ran down his spine as a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears. A faint shuffle, the lightest whisper of movement, though no living being was visible. He turned slowly, his flashlight sweeping the hallways, and that's when he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the room, pale, thin, and draped in what appeared to be a decades-old hospital gown. Its eyes were dark, deep pools that seemed impossibly ancient and yet familiar. The figure's gaze was fixed on him, unwavering. Blake's mind raced. Could this be Elias Grant? Impossible. Grant had been a teenager when the hidden floor was first sealed decades ago. But here he was, or something claiming to be him, standing silently in the shadows, as if waiting for Blake to notice. Are you Elias? Blake asked, his voice steady though his heart thundered in his chest. The figure tilted its head slowly, a small, almost sad smile forming. They kept me here, it said in a low, hollow voice. They locked me away. So I learned how to leave. Blake's grip on the flashlight tightened. Where's Emily Carter? He demanded. The figure took a slow step forward, and Blake noticed that the air around it seemed to warp subtly, the shadows bending unnaturally. She's safe from them now, it replied. She listens. She understands. Blake's pulse quickened. Did you take her? The figure shook its head gently. No. She came with me. Blake's mind reeled. What do you mean? Where is she? The figure took another step closer, and Blake felt the temperature drop further, a cold that penetrated his bones. Some doors you can't see, it murmured. They don't open for everyone. She was afraid. She didn't want to be found. Like I was. Blake's stomach churned. The reality of the situation was dawning on him. The Hollow Creek Psychiatric Hospital had hidden secrets for decades, secrets that had created Elias, or perhaps allowed him to become something beyond human comprehension. He had learned to navigate spaces that didn't exist, to move through doors that were closed to others, to exist where no one else could. And Emily Carter, the nurse who had vanished in the locked ward, had encountered the same fate. She had entered a place ordinary people couldn't follow, a place where walls were not barriers, and she had chosen to stay. Blake's mind raced. You mean she's gone? The figure's gaze softened. Gone? No. She's with me. She's free from them. Free from what they were doing. Blake took a cautious step forward, his training pushing him to seek answers, even in impossible circumstances. What were they doing? What happened in this hospital? The figure's eyes darkened, and a faint sigh seemed to echo through the basement. They experimented. They broke minds to fix them. They locked us in rooms, in darkness, in silence. They thought isolating us would erase the truth. But it only taught me how to leave. How to see beyond walls, beyond doors, beyond Faye. Blake swallowed hard. He tried to rationalize what he was hearing, but each word seemed to resonate with an undeniable truth. The logs, the missing files, the accounts of patients, the whispers, all pointed to a reality too disturbing for ordinary comprehension. Emily, does she remember any of this? Does she know what happened to her? The figure nodded slowly. She remembers. She understands. And she chose not to return. She was afraid of them. Afraid of what the locked ward represents. She didn't want to be part of their lives anymore. Blake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The nurse, the professional, the young woman he had admired for her courage, had made a choice no one else could. She had stepped into a world that defied the laws of nature and had accepted it rather than be imprisoned by the twisted control of Hollow Creek. He looked around the basement again. The chains, the metal bed, the scratches on the walls, all were evidence of decades of confinement and fear, yet they seemed meaningless in the presence of the figure before him. You're saying she's alive, but in a place no one can reach. Blake's voice trembled despite his best efforts to remain composed. The figure nodded. Alive, yes. Free, yes. But bound to a world they never understood. I am too. We learned to move where they cannot. They thought walls could contain us. They thought time could erase us. They were wrong. Blake's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed for him to retreat, to leave this place. But he could not. The detective in him needed answers. He needed closure, even if it meant facing the impossible. And you, he asked, are you human? The figure paused. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, reflecting something deep and old. I was. Once. They made me into something else. Something that can exist in between. In the cracks. In the darkness. In places they cannot control. The air in the basement trembled, almost as if the walls themselves were listening. Blake realized then that he was in a place where logic and reality were fragile, where the rules that governed the outside world did not apply. He understood that Hollow Creek was more than a hospital. It was a trap, a labyrinth designed to contain what the staff feared most. And Elias Grant, or whatever he had become, had escaped the trap entirely. Blake took another step forward, his mind racing for a question that could make sense of it all. Emily, she'll never come back. The figure's eyes softened, almost human in their expression. She came to a choice. She chose freedom over being controlled. She chose to understand. And in that understanding, she cannot return to your world, just as I cannot. Blake's hand shook. The reality was unbearable, yet undeniable. Hollow Creek had hidden not just a missing nurse, but decades of secrets, experiments, and the existence of someone, or something, beyond ordinary comprehension. The detective realized the truth was far darker than he had imagined. The walls, the wards, the doors, they were not barriers for Elias. They were pathways. The ordinary world was a cage, and he had learned to escape. Blake took a cautious step back, trying to process everything. The whispers of the patients, the disappearing footage, the glitches in the security system. It all made sense now. Elias, or what he had become, could manipulate spaces that did not exist for ordinary people, move through walls, and appear or vanish at will. Emily had entered a world that she could not fully comprehend, and she had chosen to stay. Blake's flashlight flickered, and in that moment, he saw movement at the edge of his vision. The figure of Elias began to fade, as if sinking into the walls themselves. The detective tried to follow, but the walls were solid once again. A soft voice echoed through the basement, gentle but final. You should leave. Before the doors close. The floor trembled slightly, dust falling from the ceiling. Blake realized the figure was no longer bound by the physical rules of the building. He took a step toward the stairwell, urging Dixon to follow. The guard hesitated, wide-eyed and trembling, but Blake pulled him forward. They ascended the narrow stairwell, each step resonating with the weight of what they had just witnessed. When they emerged into Ward C, the building was alive with alarms and panic. Patients shouted, doors slammed, and staff ran in every direction. The emergency lights flickered, casting harsh, red-tinted shadows. Blake and Dixon stumbled out into the main hallway, gasping for air. Everything was back to normal on the surface, yet they both knew it was an illusion. Hollow Creek was no longer merely a hospital. It was a place of shadows, of corridors that led nowhere, and of secrets that could not be contained. By the next morning, the hospital was shut down. Authorities claimed there had been a gas leak, an emergency precaution to justify the evacuation. Staff packed hurriedly, leaving behind equipment, files, and the rusted furniture in the hidden basement. Blake filed his report, though many of its details were classified and buried deep in official records. No one outside law enforcement was allowed to know the full extent of the basement, the experiments, or the strange abilities attributed to Elias Grant. Emily Carter was never found. The two missing guards who had accompanied Blake on previous nights were never recovered. The hospital was abandoned, left to decay, and stories of strange lights, whispers, and shadowy figures circulated among locals. Sometimes, Blake would walk past the abandoned building and swear he saw someone, or something, standing in the upper windows. A thin, pale figure, draped in the old hospital gown, watching him silently, waiting, checking. He knew the truth of Ward C could never be fully revealed, yet he also knew that the shadow of Elias Grant and the mystery of Emily Carter would haunt Hollow Creek forever. The detective understood one final, terrifying reality. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some places exist beyond human comprehension. And some people, or beings, walk among the living and the forgotten, choosing when to be seen and when to vanish into darkness. As Blake drove away from Hollow Creek for the last time, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the abandoned hospital. The windows glinted in the morning sun, empty and silent, yet in his mind, he could see the pale figure of Elias standing at the top-floor window, watching, waiting, and reminding him that some truths were never meant to be fully understood. Hollow Creek was a warning, a monument to fear, and a testament to the fact that not all who disappear are truly gone. Some remain, between worlds, between walls, between moments, and some choose not to return.